Hello. This is Derek from One River Tea and Tao Teaware. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this episode, I want to talk more about my spring sourcing trip in Yunnan. Last I left you guys, we just left Fuding, we got out to Linsang. I participated in that beautiful tomb sweeping ceremony up on Kuashan, in amidst the groves of these white tea bushes where they're burning incense and they're burning money and they're leaving offerings to their ancestors. Really amazing, thick culture up there. I didn't get a chance to talk about the tea gardens themselves, which maybe I'll talk about a little today. And then I'll go into Xiao, and if there's time, I can even get to the village of Dongguo. These are all villages in Linsang. Kuashan is up in north, and then there's the Mengku area. The Mengku area has the Dongguo, the Molie. It has Xiao, it has the most famous of all, Bingdao. And so I'm avoiding Bingdao for now. I'm going for one of the big ones, Xigui, and slowly building up my understanding of that, because Xigui, Bingdao, these are very similar to Laobanjiang, where if you're familiar with Pu'er tea, you know Laobanjiang is so difficult to get a real Laobanjiang at almost any price. And so Xigui is very similar to that. You know, a lot of people who buy and sell Pu'er tea told me to avoid Xigui just because it was so difficult to get the authentic thing and the prices are going to be so high. Bingdao is one that I just don't even bother with. I know a guy who makes incredible Bingdao, Danju, single trees, Gushu, and he sells it for astronomical prices. Like the price is similar to Tang Shaojun in Dragonwell, meaning like 10,000 US dollars for 500 grams. Like it's insanity up there. Prices are kind of unchecked. It's really, really good tea though. And I had some good stuff that was, they told me it was Bingdao, and it tasted really nice, really milky, really delicate. The only thing that worried me is that the price was very affordable. And so I'm like, this doesn't match my understanding of it. So I'm taking a little more time before I actually start sourcing the Bingdao. But I really like Xiao and Molie and the Dongguo area. They call this like the little Bingdao sometimes. It has very similar taste characteristics, similar to Roar. It's in the Mengku region. It is southeast of the Dashui Shan. And so this whole kind of like mountain shelf area has a similar characteristic to the teas. The only difference here is that Bingdao has the history, has like Qing Dynasty gardens and stuff like that. People really looking after the teas. Anyways, I'll talk about that today. But before that, I just want to, break the fourth wall and say, like, I feel like I've just been so busy the past 2 months, because ever since mid-March, I've been out in tea mountains. And for me, as I mentioned, this is the fun part of the job, really exciting, traveling through the lands of mountains and rivers, meeting people, drinking the freshest tea on the planet, and just really experiencing just absolutely beautiful views, because that's one thing that I really love is like tea and nature go hand in hand. And a lot of these iconic core region places for tea are also some of the most stunning places I've seen as far as the natural aspect goes. Great mountains, mist, clouds, nature, and just in the small depths, humanity. It reminds me of a Chinese painting. Like, if you look at these old scrolls, these Chinese paintings, there's one very famous one called 1,000 Miles of Mountains and Rivers. In Chinese, that's the Qianli Jiangshan, and it was one of the masterpieces of the Northern Song Dynasty. It is this massive scroll. I forget exactly how large it is, but I think it's like 18 meters long. It was made, here it is. It was, I'm looking it up right now. I don't have all this stuff memorized, by the way. I do so much research for this podcast. There are things that I've heard about that I just don't know the details of. So anyways, it was created in 1113 in the Northern Song Dynasty. and it is just an incredible piece. If you look it up, it's all just like on this like stained brown silk. It's got green and blue mountains, and it just goes on and on. It's a scroll that's like 11, like almost 12 meters long. It was made by this young gifted genius who was like 18 years old when he painted this thing, and it is just one of the legendary pieces, masterpieces of Chinese landscape paintings that ever existed. And if you look at it, it's mostly just mountains and rivers, trees here and there, and then you look a little closer, and nestled in between the mountains, in kind of in inconspicuous places, you'll see a small settlement, a small village. You'll see a little tiny bridge connecting two massive mountains, and then a farmer walking through it. For me, this is a glimpse almost into the cosmology of the ancient Chinese mind, humans' place in the natural universe, and it is a tiny place. You know, the Gaiwan has three layers to it. It has the D, the Wan, the Gai, the saucer, the bowl, and the lid, and they say, oh, this is the three parts of, heaven and earth. The saucer is the earth, the lid is heaven, and then the bowl and the tea, that is just the living world that's all kind of meshed in between. That's the world of man, right? And so somewhere in between where heaven and earth collide, that's where the humanity lives. And so in between these vast mountains, you'll just see one small farmer. You'll see a little boat on this void of like white ocean or white lake. And for me, when I'm sourcing the teas, I get out into these, in my mind, just these mythic regions where I feel like I'm in one of these paintings. I feel like I'm that small person walking through the mountains in like a Chinese landscape painting. And when you get out there, it really does sometimes look like it, because when you get to high elevations in China with the mountains just rolling and rolling and rolling, and then the clouds come in, the fog comes in. Sometimes in the Wudong Mountains, I couldn't see anything. It was just pure fog. Other times the fog would just part, and I would see just this incredible vista of mountains stretching off into the distance. And anyways, for me, that was a long tangent on why I love getting out into the mountains in March and April. I think maybe in the last episode I talked about how it was so so difficult, so taxing, but really it's enlightening, it's enlivening, it's really life affirming and all that. As Joseph Campbell says, we're all just seeking that experience of being alive. And for me, that's when I do feel the most alive. And I kind of tell myself when I'm traveling through these mountains, when I'm not sleeping, when I'm not eating so well, when I'm just always on the train, 6 hours here, 4 hours here, a crazy ride through the mountains, I'm like, don't worry. In May, you'll be back in Yangzhou, back in your apartment, and you can rest. And while it's kind of true, there's still so much work, right? So I'm out in the mountains in March and April buying everything, and then I get back to my apartment in May, and then I have to start selling it all. And so these past couple of weeks, I've been so busy getting all of the new teas up, taking photos, doing tasting notes, doing website design. And so for me, it's another cool thing why I like this business, because I get both worlds. I get out into the natural world, and then I sit inside a small room with my computer for weeks and weeks at a time. I mean, that's not the fun part, but it's a necessary part. It's like breathing, right? You breathe in, you breathe out. Anyways, so yeah, I've been doing a lot of podcasts. I've been doing so much of this breathing out, if you will. I have a lot of material, the drone footage, the video footage. I still need to edit all of those. And I just really don't have time. That's a summer project, because right now we just got in 6 new Pu'er teas from Linsang. And so I'm taking photos, I'm doing tasting notes, I'm really getting to know these teas, putting up on the website for a later June release. We already released all of our green teas. I'm trying to figure out how to look at that going forward. How much do we need? How much did we sell last year? I'm looking at pressing some white tea cakes this month and seeing how soon we can get those out. So yeah, so really what happens is March and April, I'm out in the mountains drinking the tea before it's made. May, I'm back in my apartment getting ready to sell the tea that is already made. And so yeah, like March and April, that's me breathing in, getting all this experience. And then May comes and I have to breathe out, and I have to share all the experience and share all these teas, which, it's the necessary part of it. So kind of where I left you guys in the last episode, I had gotten into Kuashan and they weren't picking any teas. Instead, they invited me to the tomb sweeping ceremony. We burned incense, we burned money, we made food for the spirits and left it out. And I got to really participate with the Wong family in their ancestral home. And I got to see all the brothers kind of came back, and it was a really cool experience. And then I got to explore the actual tea garden, or several different tea gardens, where this stuff comes from. And so Kuashan is the name of a place. It's a kind of a mountain, and on that mountain they have a lot of different gardens, a lot of different people making teas. And so we're working with the Wong family, and the Wong family have also cooperated with a few other families, and so they have like 3 or 4 distinct gardens of Xiao Mu on the mountain. They're very clear where they're like, we don't do gushu. This could be dashu if you want to call it that, but we call it Xiao Mu. Now, again, Xiaomu just means that these are tea trees and not tea bushes. Xiaomu is a word that is kind of in opposition to Guanmu. Guanmu is tea bushes. Xiaomu is like tea trees. And then one step above Xiaomu is the Dashu. Dashu is big trees. And then one step above that, that's Gushu. And that's what everyone really, really wants, right? And so Gushu, there's no cut and dry terminology for it. Usually it's just the ancient trees, the oldest trees on the mountain, usually 100 years old, maybe more than that, a few hundred years old if you can. As I mentioned, the Qing dynasty is when you see a lot of these tea gardens in the region, and so that's about 300 years, right? And so potentially you could get some gushu that's 300 years, but a lot of it is going to be 100, maybe 200 years old. The dashu, maybe that's 80, 90. In this climate, it grows really, really quickly because, in the Wudang Mountains where we get the dansong from, the 80-year-old tea trees really still look very spindly. I mean, they have a lot of, moss on it, but they still look very small compared to their Yunnan counterparts. Of course, it is also a different varietal of tea. Anyways, on this mountain in northern Linsang, where we're getting the Kuashan from, the biggest garden there is Guanmu, and so they're just little tea shrubs. I have some aerial views of this, some drone footage. It looks beautiful. It's very well manicured. It's kind of a county run, so government organized, and it's called the Manhao Cha Yuan. And so there's a real big distinction between the Manhao and the Kuashan, even though they're growing right next to each other. And it's very clear when you see the drone shot. The Manhao garden is just this beautifully manicured, terraced garden. It looks immaculate. It looks beautiful. And then the Kuashan is just this clump of trees that you can't even tell they're tea, just because they look like just regular trees. And so we went up there, walked through the really manicured rows of the Manhao. I got a lot of good photos, and they're kind of telling me take photos of this because this is the most beautiful stuff. And it's well, my goal here, which I didn't get to do in 2023, is actually see where these leaves are coming from. And so they're okay, we'll go over to the Kuashan area. And so we walk through the fields, we get there, and as soon as we hit that border where the Kuashan Xiaomu begins, it's so distinct. I mean, these trees are twice as tall as we are, sometimes 3 times the height of us, and we just walk into it like a grove. As soon as you walk in, there's less ground cover. You don't see it planted in rows. These are just the oldest tea trees on the mountain, essentially. And they're still not very old. Maybe they're from the 80s or something like that. So these would be 60, 70-year-old trees where they're some of them could be called dashu. And even here and there, you'll get 1 or 2 gushu. And the gushu is kind of destined for other things, maybe they do a singular picking. Though last year when I asked, Lanjie, my connection here, who's married into the Wong family, she said, in Kuashan they don't distinguish dashu, gushu, chalmu. They all just pick it and make it together. My suspicion here would be that they're probably making some danju out of the biggest trees on the mountain. Anyways, it was really nice to see where this tea is coming from, see the familiarity of the farmers, because again, it's like Sister Meng in Bangdong, when she's walking around the mountain, jumping over ravines, stepping on boulders, and this boulder and that boulder, and pointing out the biggest, oldest trees. You get this feeling this is somebody who was born and raised here. This is somebody who, this is their backyard, and they really have this deep connection to the land. I mean, in Kwashan, of course they do. I mean, that's where their family is buried, right? And that's where their tombs are. This is their ancient ancestral home ground. And so it's really just comforting to me to know that we're getting the tea directly from the people, that cultivated it, that grew it, that care for it, that lived there. And so we see a few different of these gardens spaced throughout the mountain, right? And so I say they're working with a few other households. It's not just the Wang family. The Kuashan is kind of this loose term for all of the Qiaomu on the mountain, right? Everything else is this Guanshu, or here and there they're trying to cultivate new trees, but they're still not in the Kuashan category. One thing that I saw here that I really, really love are all of the little chickens. I call them the skinny chickens. In Chinese, they call them the pao bu ji, like the running chickens. And this is something, honestly, this is something I first saw in Laos, in Lao. In 2019, when I was driving through Laos on a motorcycle, I would see all the villages had these small, really, really skinny chickens. And I'm like, I've never seen chickens this small before. And I have a friend, a chef, Michael Rosenblum. He says, like, oh, you'll see this anywhere south of the Tropic of Cancer. These really, really skinny chickens, like really like fine, lean meat and stuff. But it's like really iconic to this region in my mind. And for me, I saw so many in Kwashan that I got a really good picture of the chicken looking directly at me, and there's like a duck next to it and stuff. And it looks so inquisitive, so thoughtful, that I kind of drew some math equations behind it. How do you figure out the volume of a cone, a cylinder, the circumference of a circle? And I drew it in really fine lines right on the picture. And then I'm using that for the tea cake wrapper for this Kwashan material. And for me, it's just ridiculous. It makes me laugh every time I look at it. And it really doesn't need to mean anything sometimes. It's just something that makes me happy. And I hope a lot of people will like it too. But again, like a lot of times some of these tea cake wrapping designs, they're kind of built in that cauldron, in that crucible of time where it's like, I'm on the mountain and I need cake wrappers right now. And I put out the call on Tea Soup, like, oh, I'm looking for people that can help me with tea wrappers. I got a lot of beautiful art, some really cool designs and everything. However, the more I get into Tao Tiwer with Dart, if you listen to Between the Cracks, the podcast episodes on YouTube, we talk all about brand identity. We talk about, is this on brand, is this off brand? And so as I'm curating this release of Pu'er teas from Lin Sang, I'm starting to get this design and this design and this design, and I had some other beautiful art that I was planning on using, and I put that in the mix, and it looked off. It looked out of place. There wasn't anything wrong with the art. It was just it didn't feel like it fit with everything else. And so I'm like, okay, like if I do this custom artwork, I'll probably just do an entire release of custom pieces, right? Or collaborations of people who sent in artwork, and I'll just do a whole pressing of a bunch of different cakes that are not my art. But if I'm doing mostly my art and then I just have one piece that's not my art, it looks like a sore thumb or something like that. It sticks out very, very easily. And so anyways, I'll kind of explain how I got the other photos and all the other pictures and the other art for the tea cake wrappers as we go through this. But the story here is all about the skinny chickens that I kept seeing all throughout the mountain. And then also it ties back to the idea that we ate these chickens, right? Like as soon as I got to Kwashan, the first time I stepped foot into the house where they're making the teas, in the pavilion outside, they're killing chickens. And I walk in, I'm like, what are you guys doing? And I'm like, oh my God, you just cut that chicken's, okay. Ooh. And then I see all the blood, and they're washing it, picking off the leaves. And then we go make that into a feast, a spirit feast for the ancestors, and we offer it to them. And then they give me both the chicken legs, and I feel very honored. And then as we're hiking through these fields, I'm seeing all of these skinny chickens. And so for me, it has that kind of level of connection to the land, to the people, to the rituals. And then I just added something silly to make me laugh when I'm looking at that cake. Anyways, one thing that I really love is just seeing the tea makers in their gardens, because this guy, Mr. Wang, he's walking through and he just does that thing where he just touches like all the leaves as he's passing by. He'll grab like a bigger stem, a bigger branch, and just kind of hold on to it and kind of look at it. And he's just in his own world, in his own mind, and I just wonder like what's going on. And I have a few good photos, and I actually used the Neifei The Neifei is it's kind of inner ticket. It's a weird Chinese word that is very, very specific to Pu'er tea. This is kind of the tag of authenticity that gets pressed into the Pu'er tea cakes. So if you look at a Pu'er tea cake, you open it up, pressed in between the leaves sometimes, you'll have this little piece of paper. And that little piece of paper is like the authenticity ticket. So it's like, oh, it's not faked. And so one thing that we do is we put our One River Tea logo inside the tea cakes in the Neifei. That way everyone who gets that cake knows that it was actually pressed by us. It's not a tea cake we bought and then wrapped ourselves. It's something that we commissioned. That because the only way to get the Neifei in there is to be with that tea when it's being steamed from Mao Cha and pressed into the tea cake. There's really no other way to get a Neifei into a tea cake. And so that's kind of like, I don't want to say a flex, but it is a little bit about that. It's really just showing you guys that, these are the tea cakes that we pressed ourselves. Anyways, the Neifei, the inner ticket that we're using this year, comes from Kuashan. It's a picture of Mr. Wang holding on to one of his Kuashan Xiao tea bushes. And just like, it's for me, it's a very powerful image because you just see his arm and his hand, and then he's connected with the plant, connected with the tree. And I'm thinking of like a lot of the language that we use, as, Marxists, if you will, of this idea of solidarity, this idea of fair value exchange, where I'm not just saying, here's what the domestic market is. We're going to pay you what we believe that this tea is worth, and it goes well beyond what you're usually expecting for it. We're doing the payouts with the organic tea farming in Hubei and stuff like that. Anyways, for me, this image of Mr. Wang reaching out and grasping a really solid branch of his Xiaomu, you get this sense of solidarity, this strength, this connection. It almost has one of these propaganda-esque feelings of like an old, communist picture of like two people grasping hands and strength and solidarity. Anyways, I really like it. And so we're using that as the Neifei for all of our cakes this year. And we'll just say ORT Spring 2024, which is when we pressed everything. And so, yeah, I got a lot of really good feelings from the Kuashan region. And it was my first time being there. And I'm really happy with what I saw. Now, one interesting thing that I saw in Kuashan is that the tea leaves weren't ready for picking yet. And so this is April 6th, April 7th. Last year, I went to Linsang April 10th, and they had finished picking everything. Like, there was very, 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 very little picking going on. This year, I come 4 days before that, and there's no picking going on. And so, getting back to the last episode, getting back to the recent Between the Cracks podcast with Dart, the YouTube podcast, we're talking about this time map of China, how you want to be in certain places at certain time to see the picking, see the processing. For me, according to my intel from last year, I should have been right on time, but for Kuashan, I was still too early. And so this is where it's like, if you really, really are serious about it, you do what White 2T does, and you just buy an apartment there, and you live there for like 3/4 of the year, and you're just like ready for all the tea that's going to come whenever it comes, right? For me, I have, a month and a half where I can visit, I can go out, but there's still so much more that we're trying to do with One River Tea. We're not just doing Pu'er tea, we're doing green teas, we're doing white teas, we're doing oolong teas, we're doing yellow teas and hei cha. And anyways, I missed the picking of the Kuashan this year, but I got to see the actual garden, I got to see the land, and I'm very, very happy with it. And the tea has just arrived today. I'm actually sipping on it right now. And it's really cool because it tastes a lot like last year's, obviously, because it's still Kuashan. It's the same material. But one big difference I see is that it's not as sugary sweet, like not as fruity sweet as last year's. It's a little more mineral rich. It's a little more saline. I'm getting rock salt. I'm getting rock sugar. And I'm getting a little more floral notes too. And so I'm getting more flowers, more minerals. Last year I was getting more fruit, more sweetness and sugariness. And it's the same material just from 2 different years, and both years are serious drought years. Like, they got some rain in the summer months, but really in the spring, in the winter, they're going through this huge dry phase. And so both of these tea seasons have very big similarities, but the tea still comes out different. And so I was a little concerned pressing the exact same tea in 2023 and then 2024. However, they do taste very different. And so I'm excited to be like, okay, like which vintage do I like the most? This is kind of a common motif. You know, we say like Pu'er tea is very similar to wine, where every region has a different taste, every year has a different taste. And you know, while at first I was like, maybe that's a too much of an overstatement, maybe it's not that distinct. The more I get into this industry, the more I'm actually pressing my own tea cakes and getting to know this specific micro region of Kwashan, of Bangdong, the more I'm seeing it, the more I'm realizing like it really is true. And to a point where I can be like, yeah, like 2023, that was a great year for this and this and this. 2024, better for this. Anyways. So after I finally saw Kwashan, the Xiao, everything, the people, the villages, I was so happy. And I wanted to see more new villages in spring of 2024. And so last year I was able to see Shigui. Shigui is one of the most fantastic teas in the region. It has this really nice, quickly passing bitterness that turns to sweetness. And it really is one of those top 3 teas. Shigui, Bingdao, Laobanjiang. The only issue with Shigui these days is not really even a big problem. They've built a highway that kind of connects the village to Linsang. And so people, Pu'er people, they'll visit the region, take day trips, go out and see Shigui. And so while this makes it really accessible and easy to visit, it also has an influence on the price of the tea. Shigui tea has been constantly rising year after year for for the past decade. I remember Paul White2T was saying he remembers he could get Gushu Shigui for really cheap, like 10 years ago, and he's just kicking himself for not just buying a whole bunch of it and pressing it then, because right now it's 4 times, 6 times, 8 times the price of what he was looking at that long ago. And so it's really just constantly on that rise, and the fact that they've built a highway to this village really just means that it's going to be easier to develop in the future. That said, in my opinion, the fact that it's easier to access doesn't, at the moment, change the taste of the tea, right? There's the fear that, you know, more people will visit, the quality will go down because there's just more traffic, more traction, more human intervention in the region. However, all the teas I'm getting from Shigui, the Shigui I got this year, I think is some of the best. Like, oh my gosh, I mixed it with some Gushu from Shigui in the autumn from 2023, and then I got the 2024 Xiao spring stuff. And this blend for me, oh, I was just drinking it right now, and it's so good. Like, it's right now, it might be my favorite tea of the lot, though the Xiao Sai is really up there as well. Just because of, you know, when you press the teas, when they're fresh teas, they change so fast. And some teas, they gel really quickly. Some teas, they take months and months. The Shigui was one that just immediately was fantastic. And as I'm kind of talking about the cake wrappers as well for the Kwashan, and I'll talk about that for the next tea, for the Shigui, I had this idea for a long time. It's just a black label with my white cursive script, and the name of the tea is just Lux. And Lux is, you know, like a measure of luminosity, a measure of brightness. It has this idea of luxuriant, deluxe, and light, and it's like on a black background. And for me, this tea is, you know, the cream of the crop. This is probably the finest tea, the Pu'er tea that I'm sourcing and selling, the Shigui, and I'm so happy for it, and I'm so pleased with how this wrapper turned out, because it really truly does look elegant, and the material is fantastic. Like I said, like this is a tea that right now just knocks my socks off. I can't drink it enough. And I think having a little bit of aged material in with the fresh material really helps balance it out. For me, like the Gushu from autumn is so much cheaper than the Gushu from spring. Like easily a fourth of the price, and yet you still get some of that Gushu feeling. And the difference here is that if you're drinking the Gushu from spring, it's a little more potent, it's a little more fragrant. You get a lot of sensations in the mouth and the nose. The Gushu in the autumn, it has this nice fragrance to it, but it doesn't have a lot of mouthfeel. What it does do is have a really, really soothing, nice body feeling for me. There's that cha chi. And so when we blend the two together, the spring is very punchy, very powerful, very eager to prove itself, but it usually sticks close to the front of the mouth, the tip of the tongue, the teeth, the lips, and then the gushu just slides right to the back of the throat. It's a really cool blend when you get these two right. We spent a long night with Lanjie mixing these. And so we tried this blend and we tried this blend. Okay, what about this ratio? 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 7. What about half and half? What about 3 to 4? And we came across one blend. I won't tell you what exactly it is, just because that's the trade secret. I spent hours and hours trying to figure this exact ratio out, and it was really cool because we're drinking back to back to back to back, and then we come across this one blend, and it's magic. The gestalt is more powerful than the individual pieces, and everything else was close, but this one just slaps, and I'm so happy about it. When we drank it, now when I've pressed it and it's come to me now, very, very pleased. Anyways, that's all I'll say about the Shigui because I've already talked about it. And so I know I already talked about Shigui in a whole Pu'er tea episode, sourcing episode, so you can go back and listen to that there. You can also subscribe to the One River Tea YouTube channel because last time I was out there in spring, after we went to Kwashan, we went right out to Shigui, and I took that time to use my Sony ZV-10 and my Rode lavalier mics, and I was able to get a lot of good footage, a lot of good documenting the process from picking to the final drying phase. And so you can see Shigui, you can see the food we're eating, you can see the whole process. Again, that is a project for me to do in summer, and so it's not done yet, but I will spend more time talking about Shigui. In this episode, what I really want to do is get out to Xiao. Xiao for me was probably one of the most anticipated Linsang teas that I have sourced. And for me, it's been on my list, been in my eyes ever since I turned my gaze towards Linsang looking for Pu'er, just because I've heard it mentioned so much by people that I respect, people that know Pu'er, people that source Pu'er, people that drink Pu'er, people that have skin in the game, especially in Linsang. The Bingdao farmer, like my friend Gao Lei, he's just like, oh, Xiao is so good. And if you're selling Bingdao and you say Xiao is good, and that's like your neighbor, it's got to be pretty good. I remember when we were climbing the Dashui mountain, we could see, he pointed out, he's like, that's Xiao right there. And it's like, you can't quite see the village, but he's like, this ridge of the mountain, it's so close to that ancient primordial forest that essentially gave rise to Pu'er tea. Let's talk about Xiao a little bit, because the more I talk to kind of Western tea drinkers, the more I realize maybe Xiao just is really famous in China, and its fame hasn't quite spread outside of it. Because I'm really excited. I'm like, oh man, people who know Pu'er, and I'm like, hey, like I got some Xiao this year, and they're like, oh, what's that? I'm like, oh, yeah, let me explain to you why Xiao is so good. That is actually an interesting trend I find in this work, where it's like I'm living in China, I'm talking to the Chinese tea farmers, deep into the Chinese tea scene, to the point where it's like the tea makers I know all starting to know each other. People are friends with each other that, from different tea producing regions at different high levels and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of tapped into this level of, insider knowledge as far as like, okay, like don't get this anymore, get this. For example, like the Dashui Shan. Everyone's like, Dashui Shan has a lot of ancient trees, but a vast majority of it is very low quality just because they're opening up the mountain, they're planting little bushes, and the younger bushes need more intervention, more fertilizer, pest control, herbicides, stuff like that. And I know somebody in Chaozhou, and he opened a big Pu'er tea factory, and he does, hundreds, thousands of tons of, Dashui Shan tea, and it's just very, very mediocre. But there are some really good stuff you can get from Dashui Shan if you really know the source, know the region. And so as long as I've been in here, people have been like, okay, like don't get Dashui Shan, get Xiao Xiao has just as many old trees, if not more, and then it also has it's an isolated region with really good ecology, really good health of the soil, very little human intervention, and we'll talk about that later, why it's so isolated because it's terrible to get to. It's so difficult. It's a as far as like my bumpy roads, my least favorite roads, this is probably an 8 out of 10. This is really bad. It's impassable if it rains. So a lot of people just don't even go there. Anyways, a lot of people in China, when they're talking about pu'er tea in the region, Xiao is top of their list because Bingdao is too expensive. Molia is really nice, but not a lot of people know about that. More people know about Xiao is just this, you know, idyllic land, and so we'll talk about it a little more here. As it's so close to Dashui, supposedly this is, as I mentioned, the closest garden, ancient tea garden, to the mother bush, the mother tree, the origin point, that 3,000-year-old tree that Gao Lei and I hiked to in that Dashui episode and put our hands on and felt our heads spinning. This is just, down the slope of the mountain over like another ridge. So this is the closest to that origin point of any like large majority of Gushu trees. Xiao supposedly has 1,000-year history. It's composed of 3 villages, 2 Lahu villages, and then 1 Han village. The Lahu are the indigenous peoples of the region. This is the minority culture, and we actually sourced the tea from one of these Lahu villages. The Han village came in a little later and introduced different farming agricultural ideas, had this really good relationship with them. We'll talk about a bad relationship between the Han and the minority groups a little later, maybe in the next episode when we get to Dongguo village. But the history here is that they had a really good collaboration because they kind of needed to, because it's so isolated, Xiao. The name of this village is kind of strange. I've mentioned this before maybe, and I'll talk about it more in the next episode. But all of the villages in this Mengku area, they sound like they're from a storybook. They sound like they're made up names. Like it's in a fantasy novel, it's a Disney story, it's a D&D campaign. Like the Xiao village literally translates to like poor people's village, but it has that connotation of like, it'd be like saying like, oh, the 2-bit town. Like imagine saying like, oh yeah, I want to go out to the 2-bit town, they have some really good tea. Anyways, despite the fact that it's called Poor People Town, it has a rich culture. It has a whole lot of ancient tea trees, and it has a lot of respect these days from modern pu'er drinkers. And so getting out there is, as I mentioned, incredibly difficult. After we went to Shigui has that really nice newly erected highway, smooth trip. We went up to Kuashan. Kuashan was a little difficult. My bumpy road radar, I would say like, 5.5 or 6 out of 10. Not so bad. Xiao, as I mentioned, it's like 8.5. It's so difficult that Lanjie was like, my car can't do it. And like her car is an SUV. It's big, it's rugged. We took it out to Bandong village, last year. And so for me, I'm kind of wondering like, how is this not good enough to get out there? Like, can the roads really be that bad? It was also, I'd noticed that Lanjie didn't really want to go out to Xiao, this poor people village, just because it's like, she's like, it's really hard to get to. It's really difficult to get to. I had to ask her like 2 or 3 times, and I was like, you know what? Why don't I just rent a car? Because I just got my driver's license for China. I was like, you know what? I will rent a car. Don't worry about it. You can come with me and kind of just give me the directions, introduce me to the tea farmers, or I can go by myself. And then finally Lanjie was like, okay, I will borrow a car from a friend and we can go out there tomorrow. And I was like, all right, sounds good. And so we get the car. It's even bigger than Lanjie's SUV. And keep in mind, like, Lanjie was an old taxi driver. And so, like, she's, in China they would say an old hand, lao ji, an old driver. And so for her, it should be no problem. And we pick up a friend just because, like, if you're going out to a very difficult region, you might as well get everyone who wants to go out at the same time instead of making multiple trips. We set out early in the morning, which was actually a little difficult for me because I forgot how much raw pu'er keeps me up. Like, we were drinking raw pu'er until late in the night. We were mixing that Shigui stuff. And like by 11 o'clock, 11:30 p.m., we were, drinking. We had 4 gaiwans going, and she does 8 grams per like 150 milliliters of gaiwans. And so we're drinking huge amounts of pu'er tea. It's like 11:30 p.m., and I just don't sleep. I'm up until at least 4 a.m. And then we're trying to get out by, 8 or 9 because she wants to go to Mengku first from Linsang. And then we can, from there, go up to Xiao. Now, I always talk about Mengku being west of Linsang, but it's more properly southwest. It's way further south than I expected when I was like actually checking on the map. And so it's best to consider it southwest of Linsang, where Shigui really is just east and then Kuashan is north. Anyways, it takes us about an hour of pretty smooth highway travel to get from Linsang to Mengku. As soon as we get into Mengku, everything gets a little smaller, the roads, the more traffic, because it is tea season. And this is, the jumping off point for a lot of really excellent teas. We stop by one of the most famous restaurants in Mengku. It's just this tiny noodle shop. And of course, they're doing my absolute favorite noodles, mishan. And at this point, if you've listened to Tea Soup, you probably know I'm a bit of a mishan addict and a self-styled expert. And I would say this was some of the best mishan I've ever had. Super fresh, really nice, clean broth, really fragrant, and the toppings were just excellent. It was really, really good. I ate my bowl way too fast, and I almost wanted another one, but I was like, no, I shouldn't be too full if the road is as bad as they say it is. And so, yeah, that was an incredible experience. Again, I got a lot of good videos, so hopefully there will be some, noodle videos going on YouTube sometime soon. But we're getting out onto the road towards Xiao. I look at the map, and from Mengku to Xiao, it's only like an hour and a half. It seems really close, and I'm like, laughing with Lanche. I'm like, oh, it's so easy, it should be fine. And Lanche is like, it's not, it's really hard. And so we have our nice new big SUV, and we start the drive. It starts off pretty normal, like nice paved roads and everything, and then it starts getting a little more bumpy, a little more dusty, and then we just straight flip, where it's just like really, really rough, bumpy, uneven roads curving up this mountain, dust everywhere. Again, keep in mind it hasn't rained all year, and so everywhere you go on these dusty roads, you have to stop the car and wait for the dust cloud to catch up and then sink to the ground. We're getting pretty far, and then we see this car struggling in front of us. It's this tiny red Mini Cooper, and I just feel so bad for them because they're obviously in way over their head. We're, following them pretty close behind because they're going super slow and just, bouncing, scraping against every little bump and divot in the road. And, eventually they pull over to the side and we drive by them, and I see it's just this young couple, this young guy with glasses and probably his girlfriend, and they're just like, they look so stressed. And I'm like, oh, you poor people. I would say turn back right now. You're not going to make it. And so, yeah, because as we keep going, we're still going up the first mountain range. What we have to do is we have to go up the mountain range, then down the mountain valley, and then up the next mountain range to get to Xiao. And so after we get up through the top of the mountain range and we go over the ridge, we get our first view of Xiao, and it's just this like little tiny village, like really like 24 houses on this mountain, like halfway up, 3/4 up, almost at the top. And then beyond it, that's where the tea fields are. So if you're on one ridge of the mountain, you look down across the valley. 3/4 up the next mountain, you see Xiao, and then above that, that's all the ancient tea gardens. And at this range, at this distance, they look indistinguishable just from a forested mountain because they're so large, they're unkept, and it's really cool. So we managed to get down, go back up, and then finally, after some really, really bumpy, terrible roads, and I'll have video evidence of this soon enough. In the summertime, I'll make those videos for you guys. But finally, we get to Xiao. It's right around maybe 11 o'clock, like 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11. And so it's peak morning picking time. And so we're going to go out to the mountains here soon and watch them pick, then probably eat lunch with them. But in the meantime, we're kind of waiting for the Labanyang would be like the boss's wife in Chinese. And so that's like she runs the household essentially. She's the producer's wife, and she's in charge of the pickers, in charge of the food, in charge of a lot of the organization. And then the husband, who is the maker of the tea, he probably sleeps until late morning and then stays up almost all night just making the teas. This is another household similar to the Mengjia in the Hmong family in the Bangdong region that Lanjie is kind of loosely cooperating with. And so they've formed like a loose cooperative where it's like Lanjie would be the marketing front and everyone else are producers, including her husband, the Wang, Mr. Wang, who does the Kuashan. And because Lanjie is very good at selling the tea, she has a place in the city, and everyone else lives in these very isolated mountains, right? I mean, Xiao was so difficult to get to that it took a lot of coaxing for even Lanjie to go there. Anyways, as soon as we get to the production household, we sit down, and Lanjie starts looking through the teas. The Labanyang comes back, and we start drinking some danju. Some danju is single tree, and so single tree is, it's obviously gushu. Gushu is ancient tree, and so this is a tree that's, maybe making like 35 kilograms of tea, which would be a whole lot, from a single tree. So massive, massive trees. And we're drinking that, and we're thinking like, okay, interesting. My initial reaction and Lanja's reaction was that it's not very captivating. It's very singular, one-dimensional. A lot of people who drink danju will tell you this. Like, it's not a wide variety of complex flavors. It's a single taste, but it just goes way, way deeper than you would expect. And so, for me, like, it's not my cup of tea. I know some people that they really swear by it, and I think once you start drinking it and you understand it a little more, it's easier to really sink deep into the single cut of an expression of flavor. However, for me, it's not as exciting. It's not as versatile. It's just, like I said, one dimensional. It would be like Picasso's blue period, where he's an incredible painter, but then it's like everything's just shades of blue. And it's like, yeah, it's really interesting, really captivating in different shades, different colors. There's a story there, but at the same time, if that's all you're painting, if that's all you're looking at, if all you're drinking, like, it does get a little boring in my opinion. But after drinking some danju, which, it's a wonderful experience, and I felt really honored and appreciative to have it. And I was surprised that, my reaction was that, I was a little unimpressed by it, but again, I have more to learn through it. After that, we walk up to the mountain, to the tea garden behind the village. And one thing I notice here is that the oldest trees that I'm seeing, the biggest gushu trees, are right in the village. Like, they're in the yard, behind the house, in like the garden. And that's where like the true gushu is. And the stuff behind the village, that stuff was planted later, maybe 80, 90 years ago. But still, it's not the gooest of shu, if you will. And so we walk up through just this grove of really, really beautiful gushu trees that are right in between the houses, in between the production households and stuff. And then we walk up to the cliff, or not cliff, but the mountain, the really steep slope behind the village. And what's interesting is I'm like, oh, it doesn't look that steep. But as I'm climbing, I realize I can't get solid footing. The soil is really, really loose, really deep, really dry, really sandy, and the slope just gets steeper and steeper. And I see people like midway up, and there's no clear path to them. And so we're walking on essentially hands and feet. We're climbing, we're grabbing stuff. I've never climbed a mountain quite like this, because there was no path, and yet it looked very easy to climb. And as you're picking the teas, it's really just like 45-degree slope that's like right beneath you. And so you can literally like reach over and pick the top of a tree that's, at a lower level than you are. What's interesting here is that these are not necessarily the gu shoes. These are more da shu. And so when I get the Xiao Sai, I'm getting a lot of the da shu that, they're picking on the slope, mixed with a little bit of the spring gu shu from the big trees by the village, or autumn gushu by the village. And the dashu is still large enough where people are climbing it. People are climbing onto the branches, at least in the middle of the trunk, and they're leaning over, they're picking the leaves and stuff. And again, I really like seeing the picking process because it's different in all corners of China. And here I see a few more men picking the teas, where in Chaozhou you never see that. And it's really cool. I saw this also in the Dongguo village, which is nearby, the men picking the teas as well. And so here there's a little more equality as far as the picking terms go. But yeah, we look at some of the picking and then we take the tea down to the kind of like the storage house. This is like the break room, the rest room, where people are just like take a break from picking teas and they leave all the teas that they're picking in the morning here because they don't want to leave them out in the sun. And then we help them put these teas in other bags, these leaves in other bags, and then take it down the hill. They're also checking off who brought what tea, how much did it weigh, stuff like that. And so they're making sure that the pickers are getting their fair share. We take it down the mountain, and then we actually get to eat lunch with the people we were just filming and taking photos of picking the teas. And it was really cool. It was a very simple lunch, no meat, a lot of tofu, potatoes, rice, and some local mountain vegetables. Linsang in this area, they have this really cool like open kitchen where it's like half exposed to the natural elements. They built a fire on the ground, and they have a stand for like their wok and stuff, and it's just in one corner of their brick kitchen that's kind of open to the elements. And so you see like the whole wall is covered in soot and just like black burn marks and stuff. It's a really cool experience. And then they have this like classic Yunnan fridge that's just full of vegetables. If you go to any restaurant in Yunnan, usually they'll just have a fridge full of vegetables, and you go and you point out which vegetables you want, and then they'll cook it into a dish for you. After this, we toured the production household, which, as I said, was really, really clean. It was nice, clean, quiet. It's kind of like the middle of the day, and so there's not a lot of activity going on. Just some leaves that are withering down in troughs, some on tarps on the ground. We go up top, and there's this like clear plastic roof, really, really hot. Feels like a greenhouse. And they're doing that final sun drying for a lot of the tea on the topper ridge. And so we just sit there, drink some tea, talk to the makers, and really start experiencing the Xiao. Xiao tea is very unique in the fact that it has a similar kind of bitterness first and then sweetness after the fact. Same as like Xigui. But the difference here is that the bitterness is a little stronger. Maybe a lot stronger. I switched teas and now I'm sipping on some of that Xiao I pressed. And it is, I would say I always forget how bitter it is because it ends up being very sweet, right? And so I forget the beginning is bitter because the ending is so sweet and the ending is longer lasting. It's a pleasant sensation, like drinking IPA or drinking some bitter coffee or something like that. A lot of people who do drink these kinds of pu'ers, they prefer the bitterness. They like the bitterness. And so some of the other teas that we have, like that Guashan has very little bitterness in my opinion, and it's very sweet. And so it's a very different tea, like the Bingdao. Bingdao is very milky, very sweet, very soft. And then something like Xigui and something like Xiao it has a little more punch up front, but still smooths out very quickly. One thing that was very interesting that is probably a personal prejudice I have to be more careful of when I'm sourcing and buying teas and pressing tea cakes is that I liked the teas that I had from last year that I drank with Lanjie in Linsang from Xiao the 2023 versions, so much better than the 2024 versions. For whatever reason, like maybe it was after that Danju tea that I was like, this is kind of not so exciting. It's very linear, very simple. And I was comparing it to the teas that I had in Linsang from the same household, from the same garden, and some, the dashu and some of the gushu. And I was like, you know what? I like the 2023 way more than any of the teas that we were drinking on the mountain that day. And so I ended up not actually buying anything on the mountain, and I went back to Linsang. And then I sampled some of the 2023 again, worked with Lanjie on a blend to get some of the gushu in with the chaomu or the dashu. And we found a really good blend where it's like as soon as we got that combination right, it filled up the entire mouth. As I mentioned, the chaomu sometimes is a little more front of the mouth, the tip of the teeth, the tongues. The lips get very sweet, and then the gushu is very back of the throat, very heavy, good mouthfeel. We found a really cool blend that as soon as we started drinking it, I started sweating. I was like, oh, this is powerful. This is the right thing. And Lanja had the same reaction to it. She's like, this is so cool. And we pushed it really far. We did like a 5-minute brew of it, and it turned out really good. Unfortunately, the price of Xiao Sai is similar to Shi Gui. It's not, Shi Gui is more expensive, but Xiao Sai is not cheap. And so last year I pressed, Huazhu Liangzi Gushu, I pressed Shi Gui, Chao Mu Spring, and these cakes were really expensive, like $1 a gram or something like that. And they ended up not selling very well. And especially because I pressed them in 200-gram cakes. And so if you want a cake of this, you got to spend $200. Like, that's a pretty steep entry point into this kind of tea. So my goal this year was to kind of create more tea cakes that are more affordable, more available to people, and people can get the terroir for less money. And so I'm using a little more of the autumn gushu to give that flavor, give that feeling, and then doing still single origin, like it's all Xiao Sai material, it's all Shi Gui material. And so we found a really nice blend that I pressed into a 100-gram cake that I can sell for not so much money, like $60 or so. Well, actually, I just spent the last couple of days drinking that and pricing it out, doing all of the math, and I realized I can sell it for $48 for a 100-gram cake, which is really cool because, like I said, my goal was to get it around 60 or under 60, and I was able to get it at under 50. So I'm really pleased with that. Even the Shi Gui, I think the Shi Gui was like $72, which last year was closer to $1 a gram, and so now it's 70 cents a gram. The Xiao Sai is 48 cents a gram. Really pleased with it for that price. It's so good, and I'm so happy for it because these are some of my favorite teas, the Shi Gui and the Xiao Sai for this year. This cake, the 100-gram cake, I talked about the Shi Gui is that luxe cake where it's black with my white cursive script on it. The Xiao Sai comes from a digital collage I made from 2 photos that I've kind of edited together. One of them is somebody picking tea, and the other is a pair of shoes in the tree itself. And this is one of my favorite things when I'm out, like looking at the gardens, especially these gushu trees in Yunnan, also in the Wudong Mountains. When you look up and you see a pair of shoes, or you see a pair of shoes at your eye level, and you follow the leg, follow the body, and you see somebody way far above you picking tea. It's so cool. It's kind of disorienting because usually you don't see people just hanging out in trees. But also this gives me another perspective where I can look at the different types of shoes people are wearing. Right? I saw one guy, he was picking, he was just wearing busted out like Converse, like green camo Converse where the sole's falling off. And then the one for this tea cake that I got, the Xiao Sai, this person was wearing a nice set of Supreme Adidas. And I was like, I didn't know Supreme and Adidas did a combination. And I'm looking at Adidas a little more closely, and one of the D's is backwards. And so it actually says Adibas. And I was like, oh, these are knockoff shoes. That's so cool. And so I got a photo of it. It says Supreme on one side, has the Adidas logo, and then on the back it says Adibas with a B. It's hilarious. I see this all the time in China. The copyright rules are very lax here. Intellectual property is very wusouwei, like whatever. And that's why I talked about the Neifei. That's why I talked about why it's so important to follow the tea from its origin to the final point, because there are a lot of fakes on the market. There are a lot of knocks on the market. And so the idea of somebody picking a really sought after tea that has a lot of fakes on the market wearing fake shoes, I felt like that was a little poignant, where it's just like, okay, like this idea of like what is real, what is fake, what is knockoff, what is the true source and everything. And then again, like I said, that weird sensation of looking around and seeing shoes at your eye level is just bizarre. And I call this cake New Kicks. I mean, I could probably put something a little more on the nose about knockoffs, but really I think it's one of those things, if you know, if you know the story behind the shoes, because maybe even in the packaging you can't see Adibas, the backwards D, but it's here if you know. It's in the soup, in the tea soup. Anyways, thank you guys for listening. That was all about the Kuashan. all about Xiao Husai. The next episode, maybe we'll get out to Dongguo. Dongguo is this really cool new village that I found recently this year, a few months ago. And I really like the teas from it. I was able to press a pure gushu from there. And I'll talk about that one. That one's called Tropics. It's got a bunch of bananas on the front. Again, I'll tell you why later. But again, in the meantime, guys, thanks for tuning in. This is Derek from One River Tea, wishing you all a happy spring from a little drizzly Yangzhou here in Jiangsu, China. Anyways, until next time, brew happy.